Hi everyone, welcome to February security session. So we're going to talk about a bit more about post-breach detection, particularly on endpoints today, such as more Windows-based, more Windows security. And we're going to go into how antivirus and anti-malware and things like that really isn't enough to protect endpoint devices anymore. So we're going to go a bit more into post-breach. And when we talk to customers and partners and kind of talk about security, lots of or most of the conversation time really is spent around pre-breach, your networks, your firewalls, and your antivirus and things like that. But really, we're really starting to educate people on the fact that yes, we still need to have those conversations, but we've got to think about post-breach as well. What happens if people do actually get through? How long are we going to take to find out about that, and what systems can we put in place? And what systems can we put in place to kind of automatically remediate that as well? That's quite a key point. So you all know who I am, Tom Wild. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, really focusing on security and helping partners and customers kind of understand how Microsoft operate when it comes to a security perspective. And I've also got a ninja with me. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Tom. Not quite ninja, but I am a global black belt. It's a title that we use within Microsoft to show the sort of the product leads that we have. I cover advanced threat protection. So in effect, I'm what's known as a threat management lead within the UK, covering all the advanced threat protection solutions. And Tom asked me to join this to cover off the what we're doing from a Defender advanced threat protection point of view, all of the post-breach stuff that Tom was mentioning, but also to talk about how then Windows interacts with that and what the functionality is that's built directly into Windows 10. Where we're coming from with this is what's been happening in the world. So what have we seen in the last few years from the industry? What's become very prevalent is the fact that breaches are occurring almost on a daily basis. So this is happening to companies of all sizes, from the small, like 10, 20, 30 seats, right up to the hundreds of thousands of seats. All of these organizations are having to up their security posture, and even then, it's often not enough. Putting all the defenses in place doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to protect your environment from what's going to happen. You'll have noticed, or within the press last year, there was a lot of talk around NotPetya and WannaCry, and these are two breaches that occurred, very well publicized breaches, but not the only ones, that had a big impact on large organizations, both in the public and private sector. And this resulted in public records going missing, services not being available. We're talking about around $15 million per breach in terms of cost to the business. But the consequences, the far-reaching consequences of a breach like this have impact on the customer or the consumer in terms of whether they trust that organization going forward. If the consumers put their records with that organization and that organization gets breached, that has a big effect on consumer confidence. So that also has a cost impact on that organization. When we talk about security, Microsoft itself is a security company. We spend almost $1 billion on security every year. And that's what feeds into this, the intelligent security graph. And I'll let Tom take this.
Yeah, so the intelligent security graph comes up in pretty much every product that Microsoft release these days, and it's really down to Microsoft being in a really good place from a security perspective because of the amount of data that Microsoft have. If you think about some of the systems that Microsoft have on the internet, so that's Windows 10, we've got over 1.2 billion devices connecting to Microsoft and feeding us anonymized telemetry about malware and viruses and things like that from Windows Defender. And then we've got pretty popular email systems such as Hotmail and Outlook.com and Exchange Online in Office 365. They've all been extremely popular the amount of emails that traverse those systems, it says there about over 400 billion a month. We know how kind of viruses and malware spread through email systems, and therefore we can kind of feed that in and into the systems that that we put into Azure and help our customers kind of protect themselves from that side. And also around Bing scanning 18 billion web pages a month. Therefore, if an email directs someone to an unsafe page that Bing scanned and potentially has malware on there, then let's raise the risk level there and inform the user. And from an identity perspective, all of the systems I've mentioned, all of the ones that effectively Microsoft have out on the internet, including Azure and Xbox Live, they feed from Azure Active Directory from an authentication perspective. So we know from our 450 billion authentications a month, we know what a good authentication looks like compared to potentially an unsafe one that's coming from an unknown location that you've never logged in from before, or an unknown device, or a known botnet IP, so IPs that are used in attacks. If your company's logging in from an IP that's used in an attack, then that's risky, right? It might be genuine, that IP might have been released and then reused again, but that raises that risk level, right? And if you combine that with our human intelligence from our digital crimes unit that help take down these botnets and things like that, and then all of the information that we share from law enforcement agencies and our partners as well, that's effectively an incredible amount of intelligence that Microsoft use to feed a lot of our products. And Steve's going to continue explaining about that.
So thanks, Tom. One of those elements that's fed from that intelligent security graph is all of the functionality we have around Windows. When you hear the term Windows Defender, you might think, well, Windows Defender is antivirus. Windows Defender is so much more than that now. Windows Defender is encompassing a number of different technologies. And this is where we come to the point of having a layered environment. Having post-breach security, so having the things that prevent attackers from getting onto the environment is critical. And it's kind of like an onion. You've got a different layer of dealing with different aspects of that. So we've got the Windows Defender firewall, and that's something that's been around for a long time, as is Windows Defender antivirus. But we also have new technology, things like Exploit Guard, things like Application Guard. And Exploit Guard allows us to do things like protect files and folders from unknown processes, which help us with protecting against ransomware. We have attack surface reduction within Exploit Guard as well. And the attack surface reduction typically allows us to control how macros are used within Office. So Office using a macro has the potential to be damaging. In most cases, certainly with a regular macro, which is just doing a few actions, it is fine. But when you get macros that download and execute content or pulling content from other things, that's where we see real damaging. Now in Office, you can just disable macros, and that's fine, except when you come to your finance department and they're using Excel and suddenly the whole business has ground to a halt. So you need to be able to differentiate between types of macros, and that's what Exploit Guard gives you. It gives you that ability, as well as some other functionality.
That's quite a common way that backdoors are entered into systems, right? Is through the macros and things.
Yeah, and we're seeing that more and more often, Tom, and this is where we see code coming in on macros. So this sort of thing isn't necessarily detected by antivirus solutions because you've got fileless-based attacks using PowerShell. So you'll have a bit of PowerShell that's part of the macro, and that PowerShell might be exploiting a vulnerability. So this is becoming more and more common. So you need to have a way to protect against this, and that Exploit Guard gives us that. We also have Application Guard, where we're isolating the browser and protecting that browser from doing anything, or protecting that session from doing anything outside the browser. So if I go to a suspect website and there's an exploit running within that website, it only has access to that browser instance. It can't get to the operating system. It can't get to the file system. It can't get to my user credentials. Now, the reason we're talking about this is, yes, it's pre-breach, but all of these components will then also feed up into the Windows Defender Security Center. So Windows Defender Security Center is the driving force behind Defender ATP. And this is part of what we call a Windows E5 license. You've also got things like security analytics. Security analytics gives you a score across your environment. Some of you may be familiar with Office Secure Score, and that's the same as we have here. So, but it's doing it at a Windows level, and I'll show you some of that in the demo. And then you've got the security graph. So security graph is where you've got all of the data that you can query directly using an API, and this is again feeding in and out of the intelligent security graph. And management. So management of these solutions is typically done with either SCCM or Intune. Obviously, with the technology that we have out today with Windows 10, you've got things like autopilot, making Windows deployment really simple without the need to roll out a whole image. And then that device is simply managed with an Intune or an MDM policy. So you no longer need to have big, heavy agents sitting on the device in order to give you the level of management you need. So how do the attacks normally start? Spear phishing, social engineering, that's very common these days. So more and more we're seeing attackers use things like LinkedIn, Facebook. These are literally gold mines for attackers. They can get all sorts of information about you, your which school you went to, where you lived, who your friends are. All of this information can then be used to do things like compose phishing emails. Now, phishing emails, when they're done to a broad number of people, are fairly easy to detect. If you get a phishing email that's particularly targeted at someone, it becomes very difficult to detect it. So that's when the attackers are using this social engineering. So they might send an email to appear as if it's coming from one of your friends. And it's not just about attacking individuals, but attacking colleagues who may know you or family members who may know you.
I heard one of those the other day, actually, Steve, about a CTO that was constantly being targeted, and they had good exchange systems with security and things like that. They did a social hack on him effectively and targeted the CTO's brother, managed to get into the brother's Gmail account, found out that they're going on a skiing holiday, then customized a really specific email about the skiing holiday, the dates, times, the hotel that they're going to, with a link in there as well that will download, effectively a backdoor into the client. And the CTO received that on his personal email system, Gmail might have been, or Hotmail, clicked on it and it downloaded something to give an attacker the backdoor in. So it completely missed the CTO's Exchange security system and managed to get in on the endpoint. So we're hearing a little bit more about those where they're specifically targeted attacks as well. So it's a bit tricky to detect against those ones as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point you raised there, Tom, around email. So most corporate organizations will have some sort of mail gateway in place to look at the corporate email coming in, try and catch malware, avoid junk mail. That doesn't stop people going to webmail. So things like Outlook.com, Hotmail, Gmail, Yahoo Mail, all of these web services are all an ingress point into an environment where attackers can choose to go for. And it's actually a lot easier trying to target someone through that and hoping that they'll then open that in their work device than it is trying to go through a mail gateway, which has got a lot of additional protection in there.
Yeah.
And that actually raises that point there that's in the middle. 23% of recipients opened phishing messages, and 11% clicked on attachments. I was speaking to an organization who were talking to me about all their employees will blindly open every email that comes into their Exchange inbox, because if it's in their inbox, IT must have checked it, so it's safe. Now, we all know this isn't necessarily the case. Stuff will get through. So user education is as important here as technology. Have your own internal phishing schemes so you can try and educate users about what it is they need to do. Provide literature, provide lunchtime sessions where you talk to people about what this means and how it can impact the whole business. We also see that 46% of compromised systems have no malware on them. So these are fileless based attacks, and typically these sort of attacks won't get picked up by antivirus. So having antivirus is great, and we wouldn't advise not to have antivirus, but you do need more than antivirus in today's world. So this brings us on to Defender Advanced Threat Protection. So this is a solution that's been built into Windows since 1607, so which is the anniversary edition of Windows 10. And the technology is built in at the operating system level. So in order to enroll a device into Defender ATP, it's simply a case of onboarding it. So you onboard it using config manager or group policy, and in effect what it's doing is it's setting a value within the registry that's then telling that device to report its data up to a specific tenant.
So it's not installing software, it's not installing an agent on Windows 10.
There's no agent to install on Windows 10, and there's two key points about this. Because you're not installing an agent, there is no performance impact. Nothing is any different if whether you're using Defender ATP or not using it. So there is no performance impact on your environment. The second thing is, because you're not using an agent, you have the ability to look at a level of detail without impacting the stability of the system. So more and more we're seeing kernel and memory-based attacks. So if you think about a kernel-based attack, that's fine, and there are other EDR solutions on the market who will detect kernel-based attacks, but they're doing it by putting an agent on the device. And if you've got an agent on the device that's poking around in the kernel, that will often indicate that there's a performance issue or a stability issue, and that can often blue screen the device. And in fact, when you had NotPetya last year, NotPetya was doing things at a kernel level, and actually the virus itself or the attack itself was causing blue screens on devices. Now, in that sort of scenario, having a blue screen on a device that's been hit by NotPetya is probably the best thing that could have happened, because it then prevents that from spreading. But this gives you an indication of what we're seeing here. We've got two forms of detection within the cloud service. So when you onboard the device, it sends the data up to the cloud, and then you have threat intelligence, so indicators of compromise. So these are known attacks, they're known IP addresses, URLs, all the sort of stuff that Tom was talking about earlier from Intelligent Security Graph, IP addresses that we know are threatening. We know they're malicious. One of the things that we do is we seed the Tor network, for example, as well. So we can take things like IP addresses and that, which then form part of our reputation check and part of our threat intelligence. The other thing is that we take indicators of attack. Now, indicators of attack are things that are occurring on the device that, whilst they might not necessarily be an issue individually, when you start looking at them together, that's a problem. So PowerShell running on a Windows device is not necessarily a threatening issue, but PowerShell running on a Windows device that's setting something to auto start or tweaking the registry or injecting into a process, this is where we start to see suspicious behaviors. And this is all driven by Azure machine learning. And this is why it has to be a cloud solution. With an on-premise solution, you cannot get that level of analysis and that level of detail through having a server on place that's processing all this data. Having it in the cloud allows us to have huge amounts of processing power available, and also access to data that can then be applied as part of the machine learning.
And that changes all the time, right? The intelligent security graph, it's constantly being improved and fed with new data. Therefore, the outcome is going to be different, right?
Exactly. So that is so not it's not just data that we get from external third parties. So we take feed from partners. We have threat hunters that are adding data into that, but also as other people use Defender ATP on their tenants, then we see alert conditions coming up from those that will then be part of the analysis that takes place as well. So if we look at the product journey and what's been happening with it, as I mentioned, we had the anniversary update, which gave the first foray into Defender ATP. So we have our, like, built into Windows 10, rich timeline. So we can have up to 6 months of data for every device that's out there. Then we come on to the Creators Update, which was build 1703. And here we have the enhanced detection, so memory and kernel-based detection. We have response actions, and I'll show you some of the examples of that as well. You can take your own threat intelligence into the tenant as well if you've got information. And we have integration into Office ATP. So the mail gateway that you have with the Office E5, that threat intelligence will then integrate into Defender ATP, and I'll show you some of that as well. And then full Creators Update, so 1709. And this is where we've had the unified endpoints. So all of the Defender technologies will feed up into that Defender ATP console to give you a view within the security center. You've got the security analytics, the scoring that I mentioned. I've already talked about things like Application Guard and Exploit Guard. And then we've exposed the Graph APIs. So you can query those APIs directly for alert information, machine information, and then feed off that into other solutions. Things like Power BI as well. You can have a Power BI dashboard to show you views as to your data and what the current state of your environment is. And Windows Server support. So we've announced Windows Server support. We'll support Windows Server 2012 R2 and above. That's now available within the product. That's done using the Microsoft Management Agent. But as we release a new build of Server 2016, then that functionality will then get integrated at the OS level in the same way it is with Windows 10. So just to show you a bit of the architecture, you've got the endpoint behavioral sensors that are feeding data into the analytics cloud. So we also have the ability to detonate files within that cloud as well. We've got our threat intelligence coming from partnerships and from our hunters. And we've got our own cyber division. So we've got quite an extensive cyber crimes unit within Microsoft who provide data into this as well. And you can then take data out into SIEM tool as well. So we have connectors for Splunk, we have connectors for ArcSight, QRadars available now, and we've also got a generic connector. So if you've got another SIEM tool, then you can create this connector using the REST API and get data into that as well. So I'm going to show you, this is effectively an attack. This is an attack that's taken place based upon a live attack where a company issued an RFP. The attackers got wind of the RFP and produced a Word document that then had a corrupt macro in it. What you see on the left is the attacker screen. What you see on the right is the victim's machine, if you like. So Word ran a macro. It used PowerShell to exploit a vulnerable driver on the device. And then it stole a system token from that driver and elevated that file up to elevated Word up to system level. Word then injects into SVC host to effectively hide itself, so it's cloaking itself. And at that point, it can then run PowerShell. So it's stolen the user's credentials, it's using PowerShell, looking around the environment. So we find another machine, and then I can move on to that machine using stolen credentials. The main takeaways from this is it arrived via email. Now in this scenario, it got through the mail gateway because all it's doing is exploiting a vulnerable drive and then it's using code off the back of that. Mail gateways and detonation of files within email in detonation as a whole, there's only a certain type of environment that can be stopped. When you're looking at vulnerable drivers, can you imagine how many drivers there are in the Windows platform? I think we're probably talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of drivers out there. All of these drivers cannot be stood up into a detonation environment. So that's why it potentially got through the mail gateway. There was no malware involved. It lived off the land using system tools like PowerShell, didn't touch disk. So at no point is an AV solution going to detect this. So there's nothing there for any sort of signature file to feed off the back of and actually raise an alert against. We elevated the privileges. So elevated privileges of Word and then stole that user's identity. And then we moved laterally. So connecting to another machine as SVC host and dropping onto that other machine.
That lateral movement, Steve, that's so common when it comes to hackers getting into a system like that. They wanted that recon, understand, how's the network set out, what am I working with from a domain controller perspective and all of that. And then they just try and compromise as many machines as possible until they get to the people with privileges, right? The domain admins and things. So that's extremely
absolutely
important.
So when you compromise a device and when you've got onto that device, then potentially the user using that device doesn't have admin rights, but you might have had help desk log onto that device, and at which point their hash credentials are on that device and can be stolen. One of the customers I was speaking to was talking to me about how NotPetya affected them. And this is a multinational company, and this is across both sides of the Atlantic. From the time NotPetya hit their first machine to them being 80% compromised was 15 minutes. And that was because of this sort of lateral movement, credential theft, and the speed at which these things operate.
Wow.
So let's just go into the demo. So what we've got here is the Windows Defender Security Center. So this is the main portal that you look at when you're looking at the solution. So you'll see here we've got our active alerts and we've got our machines at risk. Daily machines reporting in sensor health. Now this is obviously a demo tenant, so your sort of data is not like it would be in a live environment, but you see the types of attacks that are running. If I look at this one, Jackson K has got an issue where exploit guards actually block something. So this is where we've got Windows Defender exploit guard feeding data up, and if we go into that.
How does it actually feed the data, Steve? Is that it sends it over the internet? Is that kind of much in terms of bandwidth and memory and stuff like that?
So that's a good point, Tom. So what we do is we track process. So we track all processes, we track registry changes, we track files on the system. There's huge amounts of data that's analyzed and fed up to the cloud tenant. But we do this in a very sort of compressed way. So all the data is sent encrypted from the endpoint to the main tenant. And typically we're looking at around 5 meg of data per device per day.
Okay. Not much.
5 meg is peanuts in the grand scheme of things. I mean, you look at what people do on social media in 15 minutes, it's a lot more than 5 meg. So it's not something that we found organizations are concerned about for the amount of value that they're getting from this.
Yeah, a couple of images these days, really.
Exactly. So here I can see where exploit guards actually block something. But actually, if I go back to dashboard and look at my security operations, Jonathan W was the attack that we saw. It was his machine where that Word document was being exploited. Now, with Jonathan's machine, one of the third things I might want to do is isolate it. So if I isolate that machine, that cuts that machine off from everything on the network except the Defender ATP service. So I can isolate that machine and then start to do my investigation. So I can collect an investigation package. So I've got this investigation package here. And within that package, I have things like all of the processes that are running, all of the users that are on that machine, what files are were open at the time, what programs are installed. It also pulls off the security event log for me and other components that we use for sort of forensic investigation as to what's gone on in this device.
Steve, how does it do that isolation part? Is that like a firewall change on the device itself?
Yeah, so what we do is we utilize the Windows firewall, so that it effectively fires up the Windows firewall to isolate that device. Now, that's not to say that you need to be using the Windows firewall. So long as you haven't completely disabled it, it can still do this isolation. So if you're using a third-party firewall, that's fine. It will still use the Windows firewall to isolate that machine, but so long as it's not completely disabled.
Yeah.
And that's also applicable to antivirus. So you do not have to be using Windows Defender antivirus in order to use Defender ATP. There are some bits of functionality we utilize antivirus for. So if you look at these actions here, running an antivirus scan, that would only apply to Defender antivirus. But there's also some other actions, and you'll see those in a few moments. I can tag my machine. So I can manage those tags and actually say, well, this is a high value asset, or this is in a particular geography. And it then allows the cyber analyst to look at this machine and say, well, actually, maybe I don't want to isolate that, or maybe I do want to isolate that straight away, depending on what the issues are. Now, if we look at the sort of alerts here, these are all alerts that relate to the machine. And then you've got this timeline here. So you've got this timeline, which I can drag backwards and forwards and see all of the data that's relevant to that machine on a particular day. So all of the processes that are running, communication with external IP address. I mean, you see here that we've got the photo communicating with this service here. So all of this just gets tracked, and then this feeds into the alerts. If I click on this alert here, you'll notice it jumped the timeline automatically to that part of the alert. So I've got a vulnerable driver loaded, and I can see this is the file, capcom.sys, and I can see integration into VirusTotal. So we do API calls against VirusTotal to see if that's a known issue. We've got Windows Defender references here. So what Windows Defender picks it up as. If I go into the file itself, then I have the ability to do a number of actions against it. So I can stop and quarantine the file. So if the file is open, and you'll notice here it's talking about Windows Creators Update being required. So we're looking at this on a machine that's pre-Creators Update. But if I was running Creators Update, then I would have the ability to stop and quarantine a file. What that does is it fires up the Windows Defender antivirus on that endpoint, kills that process, quarantines it, and then puts Windows Defender back into a passive state. And again, if you're using a third-party AV solution, that component will still work so long as you haven't completely disabled Windows Defender AV.
And can that do it for other users as well, like quarantine that file for lots of other users?
So the other thing it will do, I mean, yes, you can kill that process on other users as well, but you've also got this ability to block a file. So blocking a file will use Windows Defender Cloud Protection. So that means that any time that any device in my organization sees that file, Defender AV will block that file from downloading onto that machine or executing if it's already on that machine. So that block file does require you to use Defender Antivirus as your primary AV solution now. You cannot be using a third party to take advantage of that component.
Right, okay.
So going back to Jonathan's machine, we look at the abnormal code execution. So we're starting to work our way up through the attack. And you've got anomalous memory allocation. So this is where the attack's starting to take place. And actually, one of the things that I noticed here is it's coming from Outlook. So you've got a message here in Outlook, and then there's a document that seems to come from Outlook as well. So one of the things I might want to do here is actually start to look back in the timeline. If I look a bit older here, I can see here, this is the document that was referenced. So this is a document that was flagged as part of that anomalous memory allocation. And I can click on that document. And again, I've got some actions I can apply to that. But I've also got information around what other emails it's been seen in. So, and the file names it's been observed as. So we don't just look at the file name, we look at the hash value of that file. Because obviously attackers will typically change file names as they come in. So it's really important to look at that detail. Now, if I open this up here.
This is quite cool, this bit, in terms of you can see who else has received a similar attack, basically, right? But might be called different things with different file names and things.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. Now, within this, I see I've got 3 recipients who got the email. Now, because Defender ATP and Office ATP communicate, because it got through Office ATP, Defender ATP has then flagged it up as an issue. And so what it's done is communicates back and says, actually, you need to block this file. So Jonathan got the file. It was identified as a threat. And then these other 2 users, Eva and Jay, although they got the same email, we're now blocking that attachment within that email for them. So they can't access it.
I think this is where you're starting to get real true value from Microsoft having multiple systems. So you get that holistic approach to security. One system completely separate, talking to another system and feeding it with intelligence that benefits, everyone that's on that tenant, right? Because that's in Office, right? That's completely separate to administration, to Windows.
Yeah, that's completely separate. So it is a separate console, but it does show you the way the sort of threats come in. So threat might come in on email, gets through to the endpoint, and then starts to make lateral movement. And we've got sensors and technology at all those different stages that will allow you to detect that issue and do something about it. So if we just go back to Jonathan's machine now, start to see things like process escalation. Now this is a really high alert. If I look here, I can see Word's access token has been modified. And if I'll just show it here, you see your alert process tree, and you see where this has all come from. And if I look at Word at this point, I see Word is running restricted and medium. This is what we'd expect Word to be running at. Now, when we look here, access token has been modified. Word is now running at system level. So a number of privileges have been assigned to Word as well.
So that's scary, right? That's
all of this stuff is not, Word should never be in this state. Word has become a real threat to that system at this point. So that's, and you notice here, we've got alert evidence at different points along this chain as well. So going back to Jonathan's machine. So we're now injecting, or the attacker's now injecting into the processes. So it's injecting into SVC host. So it's at this point, it's cloaking itself. It's hiding itself, not only from the operating system, but from any future actions it's trying to do. So it's kind of like it's putting on a disguise. And then we've got remote shell. So remote shell is the part where it's now starting to branch out. It's established a persistent threat on this device, and it's starting to move around. If we look here, remote shell, you've got this IP address. This IP address is a command and control IP address. So this is potentially got threatening malware or threatening exploits running on it. And you'll see a number of other machines have connected to that same IP address. So one of the things you, as part of the isolation, then you preventing that machine from talking to that. But one of the things we've got coming is automation. So we bought a company called Hexadite last year. It was quite well publicized, and that's all around security automation. So in this scenario, one of the things that may occur is these alerts are picked up. we detect that there's multiple devices contacting this security endpoint. As part of the automation activity, that would then flag that IP address and block it on all the firewalls across my organization. So no machine would then be able to connect to that device. And that's just part of the automation that we've got there.
That's a pretty neat feature, right?
That is.
That's normally the first thing that security operators do is look at use all the logs that you're seeing there, but not as easy. They'll look through their SIEM logs or Windows event logs or something like that, and then they'll go through finding IP addresses, applying policies on a separate system to block those command and control IP addresses, and that's pretty amazing that you can automate that now.
Yeah, and that's just a fraction of what's possible with the automation now. And if you think about it, a security analyst can typically deal with 10 alerts a day. Now, that's fine if you're only getting 10 alerts a day, but in a large organization, you're probably not. You're probably taking, you might have thousands of alerts a day for a large organization. You can't have that many security analysts. So it then becomes an issue of prioritization. What's important and what's not. So at that point, you're then saying, well, I'm going to start ignoring things. And you can't really afford to ignore things in today's world.
Sorry, Steve, I think that's where the intelligent security graph really backs all that up, that argument, because I think Microsoft have over 3,000 full-time security analysts or security operators feeding into the intelligent security graph, which feeds into this. So even if you don't have, a security analyst, you kind of do if you're using Windows Defender ATP, right?
Well, yeah, it does give you that level of detail, and what the automation does is it presents that, so it pulls all the different information together and presents it to a security analyst, so they can just look at it really easily and see what's gone on. As opposed to sort of what I'm doing at the moment is I'm working my way through a chain and I'm seeing what's been happening, when the automation will effectively do that for me. Yeah. And it will also give me response actions. So things like the firewall rules, but then it becomes a case of just hitting a button to approve that. I can do it in fully automated or semi-automated mode. Semi-automated requires an approval. So a security analyst would need to approve an action that the automation has suggested. Fully automated, it will just do it for you. So it depends on what you want to do within your environment.
I've seen some people that prefer to watch for a period of time to kind of gather more detail as to how the attacks happened and what the attacker is actually after as well. So I've seen that as well from the other side. Actually, let them get to a certain point and then isolate and block.
Yeah. So just coming back to what we're seeing here, the alert process tree. We've got this is remote connections to another machine. So if I click on Jay Hardy's machine, sorry, it's just because we've been chatting so much, so it's just timed out a sec. So.
Bit of a timeout. It's always good for light. Yeah. Nice.
So if I come to Jay Hardy's machine, we see we've got a number of alerts related to Jay Hardy's machine. So again, I might want to just isolate that machine, but the interesting part here is these alerts are not Jay Hardy as a user, they're Jonathan Wolcott. And that's when I can start to realize that Jonathan Wolcott's credentials have been stolen. I can click on Jonathan, I can see all the alerts related to that user. I can contact him directly with Skype. There's Skype initiation here. I can even go into, it references ATA here, but a technology called Azure ATP, which is the user behavioral analytics. What's normal for a user? What do they normally log on to? What resources do they normally access? And are they suddenly doing something that they haven't done in the last 30 days? So it will then flag up alerts. And this is, again, this is the other end of the spectrum from Office ATP. This is about lateral movement, and it's three technologies coming together and providing you a full depth of analysis around how an attack's occurring.
So you've got kind of UEBA, user and entity behavior analytics, on Windows 10 in terms of processes and things like that, Office in terms of emails and malware and things like that, and then Azure ATP, that's going to be the identity part. So what is your identity doing? How's your identity acting? Is it logging into 5 unusual servers, or 5 different PCs that you've never logged into at a different time? I think that's really smart.
Exactly. Right, so just to sort of wrap things up, I just wanted to show you the security analytics. So this is the scoring that I was talking about. What's the score for your organization? This is based upon you having 100% across all these different components: EDR, exploit guard, application guard. And as I click onto each one, it shows me what do I need to do to improve that score.
So very similar to Office Secure Score, right? In terms of guiding you how to actually fix that and improve your score and improve your security posture.
Yeah. So this all applies to Windows 10, and this is really, this is going to improve as well. We've got additional functionality coming down the line specifically around security analytics. But again, you only get this as part of the Security Center, which is the Windows E5 or an M365 E5 license. And we've talked a lot about Windows, actually. But one of the things that is worth mentioning is the fact that we also have non-Windows support. So we have support for Mac and Linux, but we do this through third parties. So we've got what you see here is integration into Bitdefender. So that gives us all our AV telemetry from Macs or Linux feeding into Defender Security Center. We also have relationships with Ziften, which is EDR solution on Mac and Linux. Sentinel-1, which gives me both EDR and antivirus, again on Mac and Linux, and Lookout. So Lookout provide this level of detail across the iOS and Android platforms. So those can also feed into Defender ATP. So we get a broad look across all our environments into a single console.
Pretty and then those alerts. Anything on your environment, really, from an operating system perspective.
And the way that works is each of these vendors have their own cloud solution, and there's a cloud-to-cloud connector. So you'd have a Ziften client on your device, for example. That Ziften cloud report into Ziften cloud, and then that Ziften cloud feeds directly into Defender ATP.
Okay.
So it's a very straightforward solution without the need for on-premise infrastructure.
Gotcha.
So there's obviously a lot more that we can talk about, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to hand back to Tom, and we can do a wrap up.
Steve, last question. Do you want to just mention about pre-Windows 10?
Oh yes, that's a good point. So we have, in fact, we announced a couple of weeks ago that we now support Windows 7. So Windows 7 and 8.1 are supported with Defender ATP. This is using the same sort of technology we have on our Windows Server platform. So it's using the Microsoft Management Agent, and that's giving you monitoring functionality. So this shouldn't be seen as a long-term solution on Windows 7 or 8, but actually look at it as a way to have a more secure environment during a migration. Migrating to Windows 10 will give you the best security posture. But along the way, we can help you out by making sure that you've got a level of protection on your 7 and 8.1 devices as you go through that journey.
Yeah, that's a really good feature now. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve, for an awesome detailed demo. And thanks for everyone to listening, really. If you want to provide some feedback and vote for what you want on the next session, go to aka.ms/security session vote. You guys voted for what you wanted for this session, so we've provided it. Let us know what you want for the next session, and we'll run through that, and we'll see you in March sometime. So yeah, once again, thanks to Steve, and thanks to everyone for listening. Thank you and goodbye.